One art. The art of losing isn't hard to master. So many things seem filled with the intent to be lost that their loss is no disaster. Lose something every day except the fluster of lost door keys, the hour badly spent. The art of losing isn't hard to master. Then practice losing farther, losing faster, places and names and where it was you meant to travel. None of these will bring disaster. I lost my mother's watch, and look, my last or next to last of 3 loved houses went. The art of losing isn't hard to master. I lost 2 cities, lovely ones, and vaster, some realms I owned, 2 rivers, a continent. I miss them, but it wasn't a disaster. Even losing you, the joking voice, a gesture I love, I shan't have lied, it's evident. The art of losing's not too hard to master, though it may look like, write it, like disaster. Our poet today is Elizabeth Bishop, an American, somewhat Canadian poet. She lived part of her life in Nova Scotia, who lived from 1911 to 1979. Instead of focusing on the biographical details of the poet, we're going to try something a bit different today and go right into the poem. Since this poem is actually somewhat autobiographical, we'll have an opportunity to devote a few words along the way to the poet's life and life story in the context of the poem. The poem is called One Art. And let's begin with the opening line, which I think is a magnificent opening line. And it's repeated several times in the poem. The art of losing isn't hard to master. The art of losing isn't hard to master. When I first read this poem many, many years ago, I was immediately transfixed by this line. I mean, it's kind of funny, isn't it? The art of losing? What does that mean? Is losing an art? Can you have a talent for losing? Can you study losing like you study art? Can you practice at it and become good at it? And what exactly does she mean by losing, quote unquote? When I first read this, I thought, well, does she mean like being a loser? Like someone who's not very successful in life? Like, ugh, what a loser. And maybe she does mean that to some degree. But as we read the poem, we seem to get a different definition of loser. For Elizabeth Bishop, a loser is someone who experiences loss. And if that's the case, then maybe losing can be an art form. Maybe it is something that you can get better at. Maybe it's something you can master. Maybe you can train yourself to lose less things, to be more careful. That can be a kind of art. Or maybe you can train yourself to master the art of losing by getting better at dealing with loss. Maybe by numbing yourself to it, or by developing successful coping strategies. So all of this, I think, is in the poem. But before we go further in the poem, let's briefly look at the form of the poem. The poem is a villanelle. It's a French form. And like the sonnet, it has specific rules to the form. A villanelle is always 19 lines long, and it consists of 5 3-line stanzas and a final quatrain, which meaning 4 lines, with the first and third line of each stanza repeating the same rhyme scheme, and then ending in the final stanza with a final couplet, using the same rhyming words from the first stanza. So, if we look at the ending of the first and third line of each stanza, we have master, disaster, fluster. We call that a near rhyme. Master, faster, disaster, lastor, not bad. Master, vaster, disaster, gesture, near rhyme. And then finally back to master and disaster. Now on top of this, the second lines of each of the stanzas also rhyme. So we have intent, spent, meant, went, continent, evident. Fitting into a rigid poetic form like this is always a challenge for a poet. But I think it works particularly well in this poem because the villanelle form calls for a lot of repetition. And the poet keeps repeating the same line, "The art of losing isn't hard to master," as if she's trying to convince herself that it's actually true. The first two stanzas mention the loss of trivial things. The art of losing isn't hard to master. So many things seem filled with the intent to be lost that their loss is no disaster. Lose something every day, except the fluster of lost door keys, the hour badly spent. The art of losing isn't hard to master. Yeah, sometimes we lose a key or misplace it. Certainly not a disaster. Even losing time or wasting time, the hour badly spent. Yeah, well, we do that every day. We waste time, which can never be retrieved, but we don't think too much about it. We can afford to waste time. We're confident that we have lots of time. But maybe these are things that we can master. In other words, get better at. Maybe we can waste less time, be more cognizant of our time, be more careful about losing or misplacing things. Maybe there is an art to that. The poem continues. Then practice losing farther, losing faster, places and names and where it was you meant to travel. None of these will bring disaster. Now we come to what I think is the central conceit of the poem, and that is, by mastering the easy things that we lose, we can train ourselves to master the more difficult things. So the poet is suggesting a kind of training routine, like an exercise routine. Start with 5 reps, build up to 10 reps, and then 20 reps. Or like cognitive behavioral therapy, where you gradually wean yourself of your fears. First you get comfortable with the word snake, then with a picture of a snake, and then finally with the snake itself. So that's why she says, practice losing farther, losing faster. Theoretically, you're building up your resistance. You're getting better at losing as you go along. The next stanza mentions some things that are harder to lose. My mother's watch. Now, I think this has a double meaning. Elizabeth Bishop's father died when she was 8 months old, and her mother suffered from mental illness and was institutionalized when Elizabeth was 5 years old. So it's quite possible that she had been given her mother's watch as a keepsake, which would have been very dear to her, very sentimental, and it would have been difficult to deal with losing her mother's watch. Or, my mother's watch could also mean her watching over her. She lost her mother as a presence in her life when her mother was institutionalized. She didn't have her mother to watch over her, her mother's watch. And this loss was undoubtedly more painful than losing a wristwatch. In either case, we're no longer dealing with trivial losses. 3 loved houses. These would be major losses. The next stanza builds on this. I lost 2 cities, lovely ones, and vaster. Some realms I owned, 2 rivers, a continent. I missed them, but it wasn't a disaster. Again, autobiographically, Elizabeth Bishop did in fact leave the continent. I mentioned she lived in Nova Scotia for a few years. She also lived in Brazil for 15 years. By the way, she was born in Massachusetts. And it may have been very hard to lose the familiar places and people of her youth. But the final stanza culminates in what appears to be the greatest loss in her life. And here she seems to be addressing a lover. Now again, autobiographically, Elizabeth Bishop had 2 great loves in her life. One in Brazil, whom she lost irretrievably. Her lover committed suicide. And the other was a lover later in her life who, at the time of the writing of this poem, was temporarily estranged from Elizabeth. Whether the lines, even losing you, in parentheses, the joking voice, the gesture I love, refer to the first lover or the second lover or both, we see that this loss or these losses are too much to bear. She thought she might train herself, condition herself to master these losses, but it appears that the whole theory of mastering the art of losing has just imploded. At the end, she's literally forcing herself to write the last line of the poem. She says to herself, in parentheses, "Write it." And this is where the form of the poem, the villanelle form, matches the content, because the villanelle form forces her to write the rhyming word disaster. That's the word she has to write to finish the poem, but it's forced. She doesn't believe it herself, that it's not a disaster. In other words, no matter how many times she repeats her mantra, the art of losing isn't hard to master, no matter how hard she tried to train or condition herself, the art of losing is indeed hard to master, and perhaps it can't be mastered. There are some losses that we may just not be able to cope with. This moment of truth, this moment of realization is really the power of the poem. So subtle and so nuanced. But that's why the poem resonates with so many people who have experienced loss, which is really all of us. Thanks for joining us. See you next time on The Lion of Poetry.